bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Marcus, very interesting. A couple of points there that I'd like to just discuss briefly before we move on. Gene Kranz, when he made that statement, it really answered a lot of questions in terms of the proponents when they would come back and say, well, okay, you can fool maybe some of these people, but how can you fool the mission controllers at Houston? And well, you just provided the answer. Again, that was the inspiration for me to write a fictional account. I put that in my third book, and I discuss about it, taking all the information that you had talked about, and Bart Sibrel has talked about, and others have talked about, in terms of the simulation aspect and the satellites that they had sent up there, unmanned satellites, unmanned missions. And I kind of sort of embellished that a little bit, but it really does answer the question. Well, if you want to know how mission controllers at Houston were fooled, look no further than Gene Kranz's own statement on this when it comes to simulations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Basically all you need to know. Oh, just one point to go back to something that you referred to earlier, that nobody has broadcast anything about it, nobody said anything about it. Bart Sibrel's book, Moon Man, where he describes his attempts to get CNN, it was in Atlanta, in Georgia, headquarters of CNN at the time, to show his film, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which they were very keen to do until they realized what that might imply. It would imply that the Apollo missions were faked. And as the producer at CNN said, we can't risk we can't risk a civil war in America. Showing this film would cause that. Yeah. And then all the adventures that Bart Sibrel got into as a result of trying to get away from Atlanta, he was basically imprisoned. He was arrested and imprisoned in a psychiatric ward. That seems to be a reflection on what the Soviet Union did to people they didn't like. They put them in psychiatric wards. He escaped from that. Fortunately, was able to call on reliable friends to get him away from Georgia and back home. So yeah, there were people who were fully aware of what the exposure of Apollo could do to the American public, because it had been so heavily promoted. I mean, the Apollo press office or the NASA press office were basically in charge of the whole thing. And if anybody wanted to change that story, which was what Bart Sibrel was doing when he interviewed the astronauts who were not very keen on being interviewed by him, it was exposing Apollo. And so you've got this ridiculous situation where honesty is coming into the whole idea of Apollo, but it's being rejected because there is such a powerful hold on the American public. I mean, I'm British. I live in the UK. You're Canadian. You live in Canada. So we're not directly emotionally involved in it, as many Americans are. We can look at it dispassionately, which we do. We look at it and we draw conclusions from the information that we have. Americans get very, very upset if you start to challenge it. Yeah. Why is that? Why do they get so upset? Is it a personal thing that they are so invested in it that they have to defend it, even if it's demonstrated that they are incorrect? I don't know. It's an interesting psychological effect. It's that famous phrase, you know, it's easier to fool somebody than to persuade them that they have been fooled.
Yes.
Hi guys, you've been fooled. Sorry, I'm British.
So sorry, when you were talking about Bart Sibrel's, I read his book.
Yeah.
And for the people watching, I highly recommend Bart Sibrel's book, Moon Man. It's a really good book. He just describes his encounter with a lot of, shall we say, government agencies, a few of them anyway, some very important ones. But when you were talking here, Marcus, something just crossed my mind. And when you mentioned CNN and how CNN director at the time said, no, we can't get involved in this, so on and so forth. It reminded me of people saying, well, CNN and Fox News and all the other news outlets, the mainstream media, they can't just read a script. And no, they're not reading a script. And I want to clarify this point. And actually, Tucker Carlson made this point very clear when he was fired from Fox News. He said he was never told what to say. And they're not told what to say, but they're given themes. And they're given certain themes like, okay, you can't really talk too much about that. You could talk about it, but be very careful. You must talk about it within the official narrative. You can't go outside of that, right? And so that takes a certain amount of talent. And that's how they've got very talented people working over the last several decades in the mainstream media to sell the narrative, because you have to be able to you're ad-libbing a lot. It's like an actor. A sign of a good actor is one who changes his lines while he's filming, recording, and he ad-libs. And one famous actor who did that famously was Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis was famous for doing that. He used to annoy Roger Moore something terrible, because when they worked together on The Persuaders, it used to annoy him because he would just go off script, and they kept that in the final edit because he was just really damn good at work. Where Roger Moore was a little more sophisticated, and he would, rehearse his lines and get every word down, where Tony Curtis would come along and get half of it right, and then he'd add his own. But he had talent in that way. They both had talent, but that was his talent. And that's the same thing with the mainstream media when it comes to the Apollo moon missions. They'll talk about it. I've seen interviews between Bart Sabrile and others in this subject with Geraldo Rivera. And Geraldo Rivera will say that, oh yeah, he has an open mind, but then in his next line, he'll mock the person he's talking to when it comes to the Apollo moon missions. And then I know at one time, Bart Sabrile pulled him up on that. And he said, you told me you had an open mind before I came on the show. And he would back off and say, oh yeah, I do have an open mind. But he's very clever. These people are not smart. And I want to make that point. They're very clever, but they're not smart. So even though he's very clever of inserting in the mocking behavior towards people who are talking about the Apollo moon missions as a representative, when he's representing the mainstream media, they're very clever in how they do it because they put in that mocking behavior, right? And the Fox News 20 years ago airing of that, I forget the name of the documentary. I know Bart Sabrile was in it. I don't know if it was his full documentary, but I know part of his documentary was in that. And a lot of the proponents will use that as an excuse to bring out the fact that, well, it was never taken seriously because it was on Fox News, number one. But what people don't forget is what people forget, rather, is Fox News are the mainstream media. They're still the mainstream media. And that, in my opinion, and I heard you bring this up in the live podcast that we did, and it was a good point you brought up, when when James Van Allen had emailed in, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but there's one point I just want to make before we move on. When James Van Allen himself, the discoverer of the Van Allen belts, the radiation belts around the Earth, for people who don't know, he apparently, through an email, said that countered the documentary, saying that the Van Allen belts were not safe, when he was saying, oh yes, they were safe. If you could just briefly elaborate on that and how unscientific that approach was from Dr. James Van Allen, the discoverer of the radiation belts.
Yeah, no, James Van Allen of Iowa University, to give him his full title, Professor James Van Allen.
Yep.
He was the person who had theorized that these belts of radiation existed around Earth. And it was only in 1958, International Geophysical Year, he was able to get a rocket with a Geiger counter on to prove they actually did exist. And he wrote it up in what people rather disparagingly refer to as pop science magazines, in this case, Scientific American. Now, it wasn't in a major scientific publication such as Nature or The Lancet if you're doing medical stuff. It was in a popular science magazine, so a lot of people got to read it. And in that, he said that it would be necessary to protect astronauts from the perceived dangers of radiation. That was in March March 19, yeah, 19.
D8, I think.
Yeah, it was the end of it. It was around 1958.
Yeah.
Yeah, March 1958. That was it. Scientific American, where he said that there would be dangers, and the best way for humans to travel into space would be to go through the radiation-free areas over each of the poles, i.e. the North Pole and South Pole. And that remained there until about 5 years ago, just before he died. He retracted that. Somebody had asked him if he stood by what he'd said, and he said, yes, I do stand by what I said. I mean, he's a scientist. He's quite a respected scientist too. He worked with Wernher von Braun and in NASA. That famous picture of the 3 people holding a rocket up, one of them, James Van Allen, along with Wernher von Braun. So he said, yeah, I do stand by what I said.
You mean his original statement in 1958, he stands by that?
He stood by that, but he then seemed to retract that. But he retracted it in an email. Now, I don't know who the email was addressed to. It could have been Jay Windley of the Clavius website. Could have been that. It was somebody. It was somebody around that sort of time who was trying to find out if James Van Allen believed what he'd said 1958. So 50 odd years later, he appears to retract it, which isn't the way you do these things. You don't retract a scientific statement, a scientific paper, in an email.
Yeah.
You do it in a publication that's been peer reviewed if you're being serious about it. Though I do have a load of suspicion about the peer review process. I prefer it to,
of course, yeah.
I prefer to call it the PAL review process, but that's not the story.
Well, very well put. And the other thing too, Marcus, is with that email, it's never really been verified whether that was his email account, as far as I know.
That's right.
So that's another factor here.
Yeah, it's a very mysterious. But the pro NASA, the pro Apollo, or the PANs, pro Apollo nutters, appear to take it as being a definitive statement that you can take to the bank, cash it, and there's your income. No, you can't do that. They're concentrating on something which doesn't hold up to any form of scrutiny. So the idea that James Van Allen retracted what he said is dubious at best and wrong at worst. He didn't retract.
Exactly. And here's the irony, Marcus. I've had many people say to me that, you're not a rocket scientist. I don't recall reading an article in a peer-reviewed scientific magazine, so they won't accept what I'm saying. But they'll accept somebody, whether it's a scientist or not, they'll accept it in an email, which is not a peer-reviewed article in a scientific magazine. So their argument is really very well thrown back at them. It's hypocritical of them to say that, right? And I think you would agree with me too that one quote can invalidate decades of research.
Of course it can. Yeah.
One quote can invalidate decades of research. And just because it's not published in a scientific magazine too, you see, it's a gray area. They like to put it black and white, but it's a gray area. The scientific magazines that they're talking about, I have a huge problem with their peer review process as well. It's basically who you know and how far down the chain of command you are, and the funding that's involved. I just recently saw a poll that the majority of scientists and physicists who peer review articles admit that their reviewing process is affected by their funding.
Yeah, exactly. And look at the number of articles, peer-reviewed articles, that have been retracted when people have questioned them or tried to replicate them, because that's part of the scientific process, replication. Can you do what this guy did? This guy said he's done that. Okay, I'm a scientist in that same area. I'll try and repeat it. I'll try and replicate it. And he couldn't. Yes. And so tens of thousands of articles have been retracted over the last few years. It's a staggering indictment of the scientific community. A, that they allow it to happen in the first place, and it's not more rigorously controlled. And B, that they still claim that what is published is real. It's not. It's a fairy story. And so, yeah. I mean, looking at Apollo, you know, you get a lot of people say, oh, well, I saw it happen. I saw the rocket go up. Yeah, I saw it did. So what? Of course, the rocket went up. You couldn't get away without doing that. But what happened 2 minutes after it launched, when it disappeared from sight? What happened then? Apollo 13, well, we know what happened then.
Yeah.
And I think there's a new film coming out about Apollo 13. They seem to be hammering it. I mean, the original Ron Howard directed, Tom Hanks starring film, mid-90s, I think it was, got 6 Oscars. Best supporting actress, best supporting actor, best music, best script, all the rest of it. And that film, Apollo 13 by Ron Howard, was all filmed here on Earth. It wasn't filmed in space. They used the Vomit Comet to get a few of the weightless scenes, but that was it. Yeah. And it was a persuasive film. Of course, you make persuasive films.
What's this new film you mentioned? I haven't heard about this.
I only saw about it a couple of days ago. It was I forget whether it's been. It's sort of looking back at the original film. It's something like Apollo 13 Revisited or something like that.
Oh, okay.
I don't have very many details about it. I've only just seen it in passing. But
okay, we'll have to keep an eye out for that.
I mean, that film, Fly Me to the Moon, you know, with Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson. I thought that was quite interesting. They pulled their punches on it a bit.
Yeah, they did.
I thought right at the end, spoiler alert coming up, right at the end, the black cat that appears on the set, it's presumably in the warehouse that they're filming it in.
Yeah.
The black cat goes all across the set.
Yeah.
Imply, I mean, I don't know if it was part of the film. It was quite an amusing story. And that may be trying to reference the famous report in Australia of a lady who was watching the original transmission of Apollo 11 and said, but I saw a Coke bottle rolling across the set.
Yeah.
Nobody could find it. Well, obviously, they thought we can't have Coke bottles on the moon. Haven't got there yet. It's giving undue attention. Maybe it was a reference to that.
I really liked Woody Harrelson in that movie. He just, I mean, he didn't have the lead role, but he had a really good role, and it was a typical government agent, you know, and we're going to fake the mission, and not going to give too much away for people who haven't seen the movie. But you're right. They did pull a few punches, and at the end, they're actually very interesting because the ending was to please both sides of this debate. Right? They really took the middle road on this. So it was really left up to you, because you walk out of the studio, because I saw it with my wife, and you walk out of the theater and she's saying, you know, that can go either way. Yeah, there's arguments for both. And when you see that movie, for people who haven't delved into the details, when you watch that movie, for newcomers, when they watch that movie, there's arguments for both sides. And that was, I'll give the movie that much credit for it. I think I wish I had gone a little further down the rabbit hole, but that's a start, you know, for bringing awareness to people out there about, hey, you know, take another look at this, right?
Have a look at it. So, yeah, I mean, also because quite a lot of it was filmed at NASA sites, you know, the launch site in Florida, where they had the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building. That was, they obviously had to get NASA's approval to film there.
Some good scenes in that too. There were some good scenes there.
Oh yeah.
Regarding that, because I was thinking when I was watching that, I wonder if this is just a fake studio or is this the real thing? And it obviously was the real thing. They had permission to film there.
Yeah. They did.
So Marcus, let's move on to chapter 3. This is a subject that I wrote about myself, but you've made some interesting points too, and I'd like to bring up.
Okay.
Let's start with the first one. So we're on chapter 3, page 30.
Yeah, the Saturn V rocket, it's called.
Yes, the Saturn V rocket and the F1 engines. And we'll start with the first paragraph on page 30.
Okay.
So, notwithstanding the technological achievement of designing and building this rocket, doubts have been expressed concerning its ability to achieve the moon landings. We are not experts on the power of rockets, so we will leave it up to those better informed to express an opinion. However, in this detailed analysis by Russian scientist S.J. Pokrovsky of the Saturn V rocket from the Apollo 11 mission, posted on ALICE.com. Now, for those of you out there, www.alice.com, that's AULIS.com. It's a wealth of information. Please check that website out. It has lots of articles on there. And the author here, this Russian article is posted on here. And there's a quote from the article here. Quote from this Russian scientist. The velocity achieved at the separation point was found to be significantly 800 to 1100 meters per second lower than that required to satisfy the stated flight plan. This finding implies that the declared payload needed for a return lunar mission could not have been propelled to the moon. Now, he makes a very significant point there, and this is, again, to the proponents that are looking for whistleblowers. You have one right here. He's a Russian scientist. He's not a Russian politician. Strange that you seem to want to have validation from a Russian politician who are just like our politicians. He's a Russian scientist. Yeah. And he's not going to get his article reviewed in Scientific America. He's not going to get that reviewed. They're not going to touch that article, right? But nonetheless, he's a Russian scientist, very qualified in his field, and he makes a very significant point here. The chief separation point was found to be significantly lower, 800 to 1100 meters per second lower than that required. Translation, does that actually, is he saying that the Saturn V rocket was climbing slower? Yeah. It was at a slower speed?
Yes.
Yes, and that's what he's saying.
Yeah, because there was one film that was taken of the launch of the Apollo 11 Saturn V rocket, which followed it from ignition, i.e. on the ground, to when it disappeared from sight. It was about a just over 2 minute long film.
Yeah.
Followed the whole of the launch of the rocket. And it had been confirmed that the film was basically correct. The speed that the film was filming at and the rocket that was launching and the film that was being taken were correct. It was done on Super 8 film. It was filmed by somebody who worked for one of the contractors, and he just wanted to record the launch of
IBM.
Yes, and it was a complete film. There were no cuts in it, so it was possible to measure the height and the speed, because there were certain points in the film, such as the cloud level, which were known to exist. I think the cloud was at 30,000 feet, which is about the height of Everest, about just under 6 miles. So you could calculate the speed from launch to the cloud base at 30,000 feet. And if it was launching at certain speed, it would take X number of seconds to get there. It's possible to calculate all this. And he calculated, I think the information is contained on the ALICE website, where he discusses it in considerable detail as to what the speed of the rocket is. And he's saying that either the rocket, the engines were not as powerful as we were told, or it was not carrying as much weight as we were told. Therefore, if it was not carrying enough weight, was it carrying enough? Was it carrying as much as NASA claimed, i.e. 46 tons to go into lunar orbit? Or was it less? And if it was less, what was taken off? What was missing? And the work you've done on the Saturn V engine and its ability to achieve those velocities, I think is very valuable, because that's part of it. That's part of the whole calculation. So to actually see the film of the of the launch of Apollo 11. And it's been demonstrated to be unaltered, unedited, uncut. It's possible to take these measurements. And if they show, as, what's his name? SG.
It's SG Pokrovsky, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he's a scientist. He's quite an eminent scientist in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
He knows what he's talking about. And this is the point now when people say, oh, Russia ought to blow the whistle. They didn't have access to the information until quite recently. They certainly didn't have access to the information around the time of Apollo itself. It was only when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation took over that the Russian scientists could access this information basically on the internet, unedited, and they could examine it, which is what they've been doing. And a lot of Russian scientists, Russian filmmakers, Russian physicists, even Russian rocket engineers have examined the evidence of Apollo, which we can access quite normally. I mean, the last 25 years we've been able to access it, since 1999. They have as well, and they're fascinated by it. And almost without exception, they say fake, fraud, fiction.
Yeah.
That's what they say. Why would they say that? They're not going to benefit from saying that. Just being honest as scientists and as filmmakers. I mean, that famous Mythbusters episode where they tried to demonstrate how it was all perfectly normal and it was all, any idea that it was faked is ridiculous. And the Russian filmmakers said, okay, let's recreate what Mythbusters have done. Let's see how they got there. And the only way they could get there, the Russians could get there, was wearing a white jacket to get enough light reflected onto the little miniature lander and the miniature Lego type spaceman. It's the only way they could do it. They say, well, it was fake. It wasn't Mythbust at all. It was fake filmmaking. So started to examine a lot of this, and they've come up quite honestly, and you could follow their reasoning. It's all written up because fortunately the Aulis website has a very good Russian translator. These articles are not in Russian, they're in English, translated from the Russian by Big Phil. He's their translator.
Big Phil, I mean, isn't it amazing, Marcus, that the proponents will defend the TV program Mythbusters? Is that their version of the scientific method? But they won't take seriously an actual scientist that comes forward and puts forth an article, a 50, 60-page article with details, from an author who is an actual physicist himself. It's interesting how they pick and choose too, which is what they accuse us of doing. But they pretty well do it. Not only do they do it, they invented it. There's something.
It's called quote mining, I believe.
Quote mining. It's absolutely.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.